Lonely man lost his wife in the cruel winter until a native girl brought life back to his lonely cabin. The blood on the snow had long since frozen into the earth, but Jacob Brennan could still see it every time he closed his eyes. Not hers, never hers. The blood belonged to the fever that took her, invisible and merciless, leaving only the memory of her final breath fogging the air between them. He stood at the window of his cabin, watching the December wind-carved patterns through the Montana wilderness. The glass was so cold it burned his fingertips. 38 years old, and he felt ancient. The mountains beyond his land rose like broken teeth against a sky the color of old bruises. Everything was white and gray and dead. The trap line needed checking. The wood needed splitting. The roof needed patching before the next storm. Jacob knew all this, had known it for weeks, but his hands remained still at his sides. The cabin that once held warmth and laughter now felt like a tomb he happened to inhabit. Sarah had been gone since October, but winter made her absence infinite. He forced himself away from the window. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. He should add wood. He should do many things. Instead, he pulled on his coat, the one Sarah had mended last spring, her stitches still holding strong in the left shoulder. The irony was not lost on him. Her repairs outlasted her. The cold outside hit him like a physical blow. His breath crystallized instantly, and his boots crunched through snow that came up past his ankles. The trap line ran 3 miles through the forest, following the creek that had frozen solid in November. He walked it mechanically, his mind empty, his body moving from habit rather than purpose. The first 5 traps were empty. The 6th held a pine marten, frozen stiff, probably dead for days. He should have checked sooner. He reset the trap without feeling, moving to the next. The forest was silent except for the wind, which seemed to carry voices he could not quite hear. Sarah used to say the winter wind was lonely, searching for someone to talk to. He had laughed then. He did not laugh now. By the time he reached the end of the line, the pale sun had already begun its descent. The days were short this deep into December. The dark came early and stayed late. He turned back toward the cabin, following his own tracks through the snow. The temperature was dropping. His face felt numb. He did not care. The cabin appeared through the trees like a dark square against the white landscape. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney. There was none. He had forgotten to bank the fire properly before leaving. The interior would be frigid now. He would have to rebuild it from scratch, coax warmth back into the frozen air. The thought exhausted him. He was 50 yards from the cabin when he saw the tracks. They were fresh, cutting across his property from the eastern tree line. Not deer, not elk, not wolf, human, barefoot, small. The prints were shallow, suggesting light weight, but they were spaced oddly, as if the person had been stumbling. Jacob stopped, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. His eyes followed the trail. It led directly to his cabin. The door was closed, just as he had left it. But the tracks went right up to the threshold and stopped. Whoever made them had gone inside. Jacob approached slowly, quietly, despite the crunching snow. His heart, dormant for months, began to beat faster. He reached the door and pressed his ear against the rough wood. Nothing. No sound. No movement. He tried the handle. It turned easily, not locked. He never locked it. There was nothing to steal and no one to steal it. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The interior was dark and cold, just as he had expected. But there, collapsed on the floor 3 feet from the dead hearth, was a figure. A girl. She lay on her side, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself. Her skin was the color of copper, her hair black as coal and matted with ice. She wore a deerskin dress that had been torn in several places, offering almost no protection against the cold. Her feet were bare and bleeding. She was not moving. Jacob stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A crow girl, he thought, based on the beadwork pattern still visible on her dress. Maybe 20 years old. Alone. Dying. He should close the door. Walk away. This was not his problem. The tribes and the settlers existed in uneasy proximity here, trading sometimes, fighting sometimes, mostly avoiding each other. Getting involved could bring trouble he did not need. He had enough ghosts already, but his feet carried him forward anyway. He set the rifle against the wall and knelt beside her. Her skin was ice cold. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. There. Faint. Slow. But there. She was alive. Jacob worked quickly, his body moving before his mind could object. He rebuilt the fire, piling on kindling and logs until flames roared in the hearth. He filled a pot with snow and set it to melt for water. He pulled every blanket he owned from the chest at the foot of his bed and wrapped her in layers, lifting her carefully and moving her closer to the fire. Her body was so light it frightened him. As the cabin warmed, he examined her more carefully. The cuts on her feet were deep, suggesting she had walked a long distance without shoes. Her dress was not just torn but burned in places, the edges blackened and brittle. Her hands were abraded, the knuckles split. She had fought something, or run from something, or both. He warmed water and cleaned her feet as gently as he could, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. Her face, now that he could see it clearly in the firelight, was striking. High cheekbones, a strong nose, lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. She looked nothing like Sarah, but something about her stillness reminded him of those final days. The helplessness. The waiting. No, he would not wait this time. He made broth from dried venison and melted snow, forcing small spoonfuls between her lips when she remained unconscious. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but some went down. It was something. He added more wood to the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. He kept watch through the night, checking her pulse, adjusting the blankets, adding more broth when he could. The storm arrived just before dawn. Wind hammered against the cabin walls, and snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond the windows. Jacob was grateful for it. Whatever or whoever she was running from would not be able to track her through this. They were sealed in together, cut off from everything. She woke on the second day. Her eyes opened suddenly, dark and wild with fear. She tried to sit up, but her body would not obey. A sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a cry. Jacob, who had been dozing in the chair by the fire, jerked awake. Their eyes met. He raised his hand slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her entire body tensed for flight despite its weakness. He did not move, did not speak. Just let her see that he was not attacking, not threatening. Just there. Long seconds passed. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Slowly, incrementally, the panic in her eyes receded. Not gone. Just controlled. She was still afraid, but she was thinking now. Assessing. Trying to understand where she was and how she had gotten there. Jacob pointed at himself. Jacob. His voice sounded strange. He had not spoken to another person in 2 months. She said nothing, but her eyes tracked his movements as he pointed at the fire, the blankets around her, the bowl of broth on the table. He mimed eating, then pointed at her, offering, not forcing. She watched him for a long moment. Then, barely perceptible, she nodded. He brought the broth to her carefully, kneeling a few feet away to keep distance between them. She took the bowl with trembling hands and drank, not slowly, not carefully. She drank like someone who had been starving, draining the bowl in desperate gulps. When it was empty, she looked at him again. Her expression had changed. Still wary, still uncertain. But something else now. A question. He refilled the bowl. She drank again. Over the next hours, as the storm continued its assault outside, they existed in careful silence. She slept. He tended the fire. She woke. He brought food. She watched him. He watched her. Neither spoke. Language was a bridge they did not yet have, but something else was forming. An understanding, an unspoken agreement. She needed shelter. He had it. That was enough for now. By evening, she was strong enough to sit up on her own. She examined her bandaged feet, then looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or suspicion, or both. She touched the blankets around her, good wool traded from the fort 2 years ago, then looked around the cabin. Her gaze lingered on things. The second chair at the table, the women's coat hanging by the door, the small mirror on the wall, evidence of a life that had been interrupted. When her eyes returned to him, there was a new understanding there. He was alone here, just as alone as she was. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, they developed a rhythm. He would make food. She would eat. He would add wood to the fire. She would sleep. Slowly, she grew stronger. By the 3rd day, she could stand, though her feet were still too damaged to walk on. She began to help in small ways. Folding blankets, stirring the pot. Small gestures that said she would not simply take without giving. He found himself watching her when she was not looking. The way she moved, even injured, had a grace to it. The way she examined everything in the cabin with careful attention, learning its geography. The way she kept herself positioned so she could always see the door. She was a survivor. That much was clear. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painful in its brightness after so much gray. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of fresh snow. Beautiful and deadly. Jacob stood at the window, looking out at the altered landscape, and felt the weight of decision settling on him. She would leave soon. She was strong enough now. The weather had cleared. Whatever she had been running from was long gone or buried under the snow. She would go back to her people, wherever they were, and he would be alone again. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like another death. He turned from the window to find her watching him. She was standing by the fire, wrapped in one of the blankets, her dark eyes fixed on his face. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she did something unexpected. She pointed at herself. Aida. Her voice was soft, slightly hoarse from days of silence, but clear. A name. She was giving him her name. Something shifted in Jacob's chest. Something he thought had frozen solid months ago. He nodded slowly. Aida. He tried to match her pronunciation. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. It was enough. Over the following days, they began to communicate. Not with words, not at first, but with gestures, signs, drawings in the ash by the fire. She taught him the crow sign language, the fluid movements of hands that conveyed meaning across the silence. He was clumsy at first, his fingers thick and unpracticed. She was patient. She would repeat the signs until he understood. He learned that she was Absoluk, the Crow people, that her village had been attacked, not by soldiers, by another tribe. Lakota, he thought, based on her signs, though he was not certain. The attack had come at night. Fire, screaming, death. She had run. Just run. Through the forest, through the snow, not knowing where she was going. Just away. Always away. Her family was gone. All of them. The signs she made when explaining this were sharp, final. There was no going back. There was no home. There was only forward into whatever came next. Jacob understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. In return, he told her about Sarah. It was harder than he expected. The signs for love, for loss, for the emptiness that followed. But Aida understood. He could see it in her eyes. They were both survivors of something that should have killed them. They had both kept breathing when breathing felt impossible. That created a bond stronger than any language. As January arrived, transforming the Montana wilderness into an alien landscape of ice and silence, something unexpected began to happen. The cabin, which had felt like a mausoleum for months, began to feel like something else. not quite alive, but not dead either, suspended between states, waiting. Aita moved through the space with increasing confidence. Her feet healed slowly, but she learned to walk again, at first with painful steps, then with growing steadiness. She began to contribute more. She was skilled at tanning hides, far better than Jacob had ever been. She took the pelts from his trapline and transformed them with tools she made from things she found around the cabin. A sharp rock, a bone from the venison. Her hands moved with practiced precision, scraping and stretching and softening until the leather was supple and strong. She cooked differently than Sarah had. The flavors were unfamiliar but good. She used wild herbs she identified even in their dried winter state, plants Jacob had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. She showed him which ones were medicine, which ones were food, which ones were both. She made a poultice for his hands, which had been cracked and bleeding from the cold. Within days, they were healing. He found himself looking forward to the evenings. After the work was done, after the fire was built up high, they would sit together. Sometimes she would tell stories with her hands, elaborate tales that took patience to follow but rewarded attention. Stories about Coyote the trickster, about the creation of the stars, about heroes and fools and the thin line between them. Sometimes he would read aloud from the few books he owned, even though she could not understand the words. She seemed to like the sound of his voice, the rhythm of the language. She would watch his face as he read, following the emotion even when the meaning was lost. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was companionable, easy. Sometimes entire days would pass with hardly a word spoken, but it did not feel empty. They communicated in 100 small ways. A glance, a gesture, the way she would hand him his coffee in the morning, already knowing how he liked it, the way he would place the chair closer to the fire before she asked. Small kindnesses that required no translation. But Jacob was not naive. He knew this situation could not last forever. The winter would end. The snow would melt. The world would open up again. And when it did, decisions would have to be made. She could not stay here. A white settler and a Crow woman living together would draw attention, the wrong kind of attention. There would be questions, suspicions, danger for both of them. And yet, when he thought about her leaving, about the cabin returning to its previous silence, something inside him recoiled. He had not realized how much he had missed having another presence, another heartbeat in the space, someone to cook for, someone to protect, someone who needed him in the small, daily ways that made life feel like something other than just waiting to die. He suspected she felt it too. Sometimes he would catch her looking at him with an expression that was hard to name. Not quite gratitude, not quite affection, something more complicated. Something that acknowledged they were both damaged people who had somehow, against all odds, found shelter in each other. February brought a thaw. Not a full thaw, but enough that the creek began to flow again and the snow on the roof turned soft and dangerous. Jacob spent a day clearing it, while Aita watched from below, ready to shout if he started to slip. The physical labor felt good. For the first time in months, his body felt like something other than a burden to carry around. That evening, she made a stew that reminded him of something his mother used to make when he was a child. He did not know how she knew to add the particular herbs, to cook it low and slow until the meat fell apart. But she did. And when he tasted it, he felt something crack open inside his chest. A memory, not of Sarah. Older, deeper. A memory of being cared for. He looked up to find her watching him. There was a question in her eyes. He nodded, unsure what he was answering, but knowing it was the right response. She smiled then, a real smile, the first he had seen. It transformed her face, made her look young, made him remember that she was young. 20 years old, barely more than a girl, while he was nearly 40, worn down by years of hard living and harder losses. The age difference should have mattered more than it did. Maybe in another world, another time, it would have. But here, In this cabin at the end of winter, with the firelight catching in her dark hair and the smell of food filling the air, it felt irrelevant. They were just two people who had survived when they should not have. That was its own kind of equality. That night, after they had eaten and cleaned up and the fire had burned down to coals, Jacob made a decision. He went to the chest at the foot of his bed and opened it. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were Sarah's things, her good dress, her mother's necklace, the letters she had written to him during their courtship, before they were married and he had brought her out here to this wild place that eventually killed her. He had not opened this chest since October, had not been able to bear it. But now he reached inside and pulled out one item, a shawl, beautiful soft wool dyed deep blue, traded from a merchant passing through Fort Benton. Sarah had loved it, had worn it every Sunday, even though there was no church to go to, no one to see. She had worn it because it made her feel beautiful. Jacob stood, holding the shawl in his hands, feeling its weight. Then he turned and walked to where Aida sat by the fire. He held it out to her, an offering, a gift, an acknowledgement of something he did not have words for. She looked at the shawl, then at him. She understood what this was, what it meant. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. She unfolded it carefully, reverently, and draped it around her shoulders. The blue looked striking against her dark hair and copper skin. She pulled it close and looked up at him. Her eyes were wet. So were his. No words were spoken. None were needed. They stood there in the firelight, two broken people holding pieces of each other's pain, and something shifted. Something settled. Whatever this was between them, it was real. It mattered. And neither of them wanted it to end. March came with mud and rain and the first hints of green pushing through the dead grass. The world was waking up. Jacob walked the trap line less frequently now, spending more time working on the cabin. Repairs that had gone neglected all winter suddenly felt urgent. The roof needed proper patching. The door frame had warped and needed adjusting. The whole exterior needed chinking before next winter. Aida worked beside him when she could, her hands quick and skilled. She showed him techniques for waterproofing using pine pitch and ash. She reinforced the door with strips of rawhide that would expand when wet, creating a tighter seal. She was making the cabin stronger, making it last. Building, not just surviving. They still had not defined what they were to each other. Not with words, but the boundaries had shifted. She no longer slept by the fire. On particularly cold nights, she would curl up at the foot of his bed, wrapped in her blankets, a separate presence but a close one. He would lie awake sometimes, listening to her breathing, marveling at how natural it had become, how necessary. One evening in late March, as they sat by the fire after supper, Aida began a new story with her hands. It was different from the others, more personal. She told him about her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died of sickness when she was small. Her grandmother had been a healer, a woman respected by the whole village. She had taught Aida everything: plants, medicines, the ways of reading the land and the sky, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. Her grandmother had died 2 summers ago. Natural death, old age, but Aida missed her every day. Missed her wisdom, missed her hands, strong and sure even in her final years, missed her voice which had always known exactly what to say. When Aida finished the story, she looked at Jacob with an expression that was almost pleading. She made a sign he had not seen before. Then she repeated it, slower, making sure he understood. The sign meant, "I am lost." Jacob felt something break inside him, not in a bad way, in a way that let light through. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. She did not. His hand covered hers, warm, solid, real. He did not know the sign for what he wanted to say. So he spoke instead, even though she would not understand all the words. Sometimes tone mattered more than meaning. You are not lost. You are here. She looked at their joined hands, then at his face. and he saw understanding there. Maybe she did not know the exact words, but she knew what he meant. Here, in this cabin, together. That was something. That was enough. They sat like that until the fire burned low. Then, for the first time, she did not move to her usual sleeping place. She stayed close, and when he lay down that night, she lay down beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her warmth, close enough that her breathing matched his, close enough that, for the first time since October, he did not feel alone. The next morning, Jacob woke to find her already up, making coffee. She moved through the cabin with easy familiarity now, knowing where everything was, how he liked things done. She handed him a cup and their fingers brushed. She did not pull away. They spent the day working together, clearing the area around the cabin, preparing for spring planting. The work was hard but good, satisfying, building towards something instead of just enduring. When they stopped for lunch, they sat outside in the weak sunlight, sharing dried meat and hard bread. The snow was almost gone now, just dirty patches in the deep shadows. The creek was running fast and clear. Birds were returning, their calls unfamiliar after months of silence. Aida pointed at a bird perched in a nearby pine. She made a sign, "Robin, first bird of spring. Good luck." Jacob nodded, watching it hop from branch to branch. When was the last time he had believed in luck? That afternoon, as they were carrying water from the creek, Jacob saw tracks, fresh, boot prints, multiple sets, coming from the south, heading northeast. They passed within 100 yards of the cabin but had not approached. Just passing through, white men, probably trappers or prospectors, heading to the gold fields that were opening up in the territories. Not a threat, not directly, but a reminder. The world was still out there. Other people were still out there. The isolation that had protected them all winter was coming to an end. Jacob said nothing to Aida about the tracks, but she must have seen them too. That evening, she was quieter than usual. She stared into the fire with an expression that was hard to read. Thinking, planning, worrying. Finally, she turned to him and made a series of signs. Slow, deliberate. What happens when summer comes? It was the question he had been avoiding for weeks. The question that had no good answer. He could not ask her to stay. It was not fair. She was young. She deserved a life bigger than this cabin, bigger than him. She deserved to find her people again, to rebuild what had been taken from her. But the thought of her leaving felt like another death, and he had already died enough. He did not answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. The cabin behind him felt warm and alive, filled with the smell of cooking food and wood smoke and something else. Something like home. He turned back to face her. Stay. It was one word. English. But the meaning was clear. She understood. He saw it in her eyes. Not a request. Not a demand. An offer. A possibility. A future that might exist if they were brave enough to reach for it. She stood slowly and walked to where he was. They faced each other in the fading light. Two people who should never have met. Two people who had saved each other without meaning to. Two people who had somehow, against all logic and reason, found something worth holding on to. She reached up and touched his face. Her hand was warm. Her eyes were searching his, looking for something. Certainty, maybe, or permission, or courage. He found his own hand rising to cover hers, holding it against his cheek, letting her feel his answer in the way his eyes closed at her touch. When he opened them again, she was closer. So close he could count the snowflakes that had started to fall outside, reflected in her dark eyes. So close he could feel her breath against his skin. So close that when she spoke, the single word was barely a whisper. Stay, she was answering, agreeing, choosing, this, him, them. Jacob did not let himself think about all the reasons this was complicated, all the ways this could go wrong, all the people who would disapprove or worse. Right now, in this moment, those things did not matter. What mattered was the woman in front of him, alive and real and choosing to stay. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. She did not. When their lips met, it was gentle, tentative, a question asking itself. She answered by leaning into him, her arms coming up around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss deepened, became something more certain, more necessary. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. Jacob felt dizzy, felt young, felt like maybe, possibly, he was allowed to want something again, allowed to hope. Aida pulled back just enough to look at him. There was a question in her eyes, not about staying. That was decided, but about everything else. About what staying meant, about how this would work, about whether he was sure. He was sure. He took her hand and led her to the bed, not rushing, not desperate, just moving together towards something they both wanted, needed, deserved. What followed was tender, awkward in places, as all first times are, but also beautiful, real. Two damaged people reaching for each other across the space of their pain, finding connection in the simplest and most profound way humans can. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blankets, listening to the snow fall outside, and Jacob felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Peace. April arrived with explosion of life. The meadow beyond the cabin turned green almost overnight. Wildflowers pushed through the soil, tiny spots of color against the grass. The creek swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, running fast and cold and clean. Animals emerged from hibernation, and the forest filled with sound again. The world was renewing itself. Inside the cabin, renewal was happening too. Jacob found himself laughing, actually laughing, at something Aida did while trying to teach him a crow game involving sticks and stones. The sound startled him. He had forgotten what his own laughter sounded like. Aida smiled at his surprise, then deliberately did the thing again, making him laugh harder. They developed new routines. Morning coffee together, sitting outside when the weather allowed, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Working side by side during the day, tending the garden they had planted, checking the traps, making repairs. Evenings by the fire, where she would work on hide crafts while he carved wood or mended tools. Nights where the boundaries between them dissolved completely, where they came together with increasing familiarity and deepening affection. Jacob had not thought himself capable of this again. After Sarah, he had assumed that part of him was finished, used up, but Aida awakened something different, not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely new. With Sarah, he had been young and optimistic, building a future based on dreams and possibilities. With Aida, he was older and scarred, building something based on survival and second chances. It felt more real somehow, more earned, but reality had a way of intruding. In late April, Jacob rode to Fort Benton for supplies. It was a 2-day journey, and he hated leaving Aida alone, but they needed flour and salt and ammunition, things he could not make or find. She assured him she would be fine. She was absolute. She knew how to survive alone. The fort was busy with spring activity. Trappers bringing in winter pelts. Traders loading wagons for the journey east. Prospectors heading west toward the gold claims. Soldiers drilling in the yard. Jacob moved through it all with his head down, wanting only to get what he needed and leave. He did not belong in places like this anymore. Too many people. Too much noise. He was loading supplies onto his horse when he heard voices behind him. Heard there was an Indian attack over near Crow territory. Whole village wiped out. Good riddance. Savages had it coming. They're saying a few got away. Soldiers are looking for survivors. Jacob's hands stopped moving. He listened without turning around. Why bother looking for survivors? Let them freeze. Orders from the territorial governor. Something about peace treaties and showing good faith. Load of horse shit if you ask me. Anyone got descriptions of the survivors? Just one. Young woman. Early 20s. Seen heading north after the attack. Could be dead by now. Winter was hard. Jacob forced himself to continue loading, to keep his hands steady, to show no reaction. But inside, his mind was racing. They were looking for Aida, maybe not specifically her, maybe just any Crow survivor. But it amounted to the same thing. If she was found, she would be taken, put on a reservation, separated from everything, including him. He finished his business quickly and headed back, pushing his horse harder than he should have. The 2-day journey became 1.5. He arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon to find Aida working in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, the blue shawl around her shoulders. She looked up at his approach and smiled. Then she saw his face and the smile disappeared. He told her what he had heard. She listened without interruption, her expression growing still and distant. When he finished, she stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. She made the sign for expected this. Of course she had. She was not naive. She had known from the beginning that their situation was precarious, that the world outside this cabin would not understand or accept what they had built here, that eventually something would come to threaten it. "We can hide you," Jacob said. "If soldiers come, you can disappear into the forest. Wait it out." She shook her head. Made another sign. "That is not living. That is hiding. Then what do you want to do?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she signed something that took his breath away. "Go somewhere they will not look. Start new, together." Jacob's mind reeled. Leave? Abandon the cabin, the land, everything he had built here? It seemed impossible. And yet, what was the alternative? Stay and wait for the inevitable? Watch as she was taken from him? Where would we go? Aida walked to the cabin and returned with a stick. She knelt and drew in the dirt. Mountains, a river, a valley. She pointed northwest. My grandmother spoke of a place beyond the ranges, where the rivers run west, where there are fewer soldiers, fewer settlers, where Absolute and whites live together sometimes. We could go there. Build new. Jacob looked at the crude map, then at her face. She was serious, and more than that, she was hopeful. She was not just running away from something. She was running toward something, toward a future where they did not have to hide, where they could simply be. The idea terrified him. He was nearly 40 years old. Starting over in unknown territory seemed like madness. But staying here, waiting for the world to tear them apart, seemed worse. How long would it take to get there? She calculated with her fingers. 2 moons, maybe 3. Hard journey, dangerous, but possible. 2 moons. 8 to 12 weeks of travel through wilderness, over mountains, across territories where neither of them would be entirely welcome, with minimal supplies and maximum risk. Everything could go wrong. They could die, easily, but if they stayed, they would die anyway. Maybe not physically, but the thing between them, this fragile, beautiful thing they had built, would wither and die. He knew it with absolute certainty. "When do we leave?" Aida's eyes widened. She had expected him to refuse, to argue, to choose safety over uncertainty. But Jacob had learned something over the past months. Safety was an illusion. The only real thing was the person standing in front of you, choosing you back. Soon, she signed, before summer, before more people come. They spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Jacob sold some of his pelts at the fort, spreading the visits out so no one would notice the larger pattern. He bought 2 good horses, supplies, weapons, everything they would need for a long journey. He told anyone who asked that he was expanding his trap lines, going deeper into the territories. No one questioned it. Mountain men did strange things. It was expected. Aida prepared in her own way. She made traveling clothes for both of them, practical and durable. She gathered medicines and dried foods. She taught Jacob more Crow language, more signs, more of the knowledge he would need to survive in territories where whites were not welcome. She was investing in their future, building the foundation for a life that did not yet exist. The night before they planned to leave, Jacob stood outside the cabin, looking at it in the moonlight. He had built this place with Sarah. Every log, every nail, every shingle carried memories. Leaving it felt like betrayal, like abandoning her ghost. Aida came to stand beside him. She did not speak, just stood there, letting him feel what he needed to feel. Finally, Jacob turned to her. "She would have liked you," he said. "Sarah, she would have thought you were brave." Aida took his hand, squeezed it once. She understood. This was not about choosing between past and present. It was about carrying the past while building the future. Both could be true. They left at dawn. Jacob took one last look at the cabin, committing it to memory. Then he turned his horse west and did not look back. The journey was exactly as hard as Aida had predicted. They traveled through terrain that challenged every skill they possessed. Mountain passes still clogged with snow. Rivers swollen with spring runoff. Forests so dense they had to dismount and lead the horses through. And always, the fear of being discovered. They avoided settlements, skirted around known camps, traveled at night when necessary. But there were beautiful moments, too. Camping beside alpine lakes so clear you could see fish swimming 20 feet down. Watching elk herds migrate through high meadows. Finding wild strawberries and eating them sun-warm and sweet. Lying together under stars so numerous they seemed to merge into a solid blanket of light. These moments made the hardship bearable, made it worthwhile. 6 weeks into the journey, they encountered their first real danger. They had stopped to water the horses at a creek when Jacob heard voices, male, white, coming closer. He and Aida scrambled for cover, pulling the horses into the thick brush. Through the leaves, Jacob could see 3 men, rough-looking, armed. Prospectors, probably, heading to the new claims. The men stopped at the creek to refill canteens. They were talking loudly, careless, drunk on cheap whiskey even at midday. Jacob held his rifle ready, praying they would drink and move on. Beside him, Aida was completely still, barely breathing. One of the men looked around, scanning the tree line. For a terrible moment, his gaze seemed to fix on their hiding spot. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger. If they were discovered, he would have to shoot. There was no other option. He could not let them take Aida. But then the man turned away, laughing at something one of his companions said. They finished their water and continued on, their voices fading into the forest. Jacob and Aida remained frozen for long minutes after, making sure they were truly gone. When they finally moved, Jacob realized he was shaking. How close they had come. How easily it could have ended. That night they made no fire, just huddled together under blankets, listening to every sound, waiting for dawn. Aida pressed herself against Jacob's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling her heartbeat against his ribs. She was scared. So was he, but they were together. That had to be enough. The incident changed something between them, made them more careful, more vigilant, but also more determined. They had chosen this path. They would see it through. 8 weeks after leaving Montana, they crossed over a final ridge and looked down into a broad valley. A river ran through it, wide and lazy, heading west toward the coast. The valley was green and lush, dotted with stands of pine and meadows thick with grass. In the distance, Jacob could see smoke from what might be a small settlement. But here, in the middle, there was open land, unclaimed, waiting. Aida made a sign. "Here." Jacob looked at her. "You are sure?" She nodded. More than sure. Certain. This was the place her grandmother had described. This was where they would build their new life. They descended into the valley slowly, taking time to explore, to understand the land. They found a spot where the river bent, creating a natural flat area protected by high ground on 3 sides. Defensible. Private. Perfect. That evening they made camp. A real camp, not the temporary stops they had been making. This one felt different, permanent. As the sun set, painting the valley in shades of gold and orange, Jacob built a fire. A real fire, big and bright and warm. No more hiding, no more fear. They were far enough from everything now. This was their land, their home, their future. Aida sat beside him, the blue shawl around her shoulders, her face lit by the flames. She looked content. More than content, happy. Jacob realized he felt the same way. Despite everything they had left behind, everything they had endured, they had made it. Together. We should build a cabin on the high ground, he said. Good view, safe from spring floods. Aida nodded. Then she added, with signs, big cabin. Room for children. Jacob's breath caught. Children. The word hung between them, full of implication and possibility. He had never allowed himself to think that far ahead, had never dared to imagine that kind of future. But now, looking at her face in the firelight, he let himself believe. Maybe. Possibly. Someday. Yes, he said. Room for children, she smiled. That brilliant, transformative smile that still caught him off guard. Then she leaned in and kissed him, soft and sure and full of promise. The summer passed in hard work. They built the cabin exactly where Jacob had suggested, using timber from the surrounding forest. It was smaller than his Montana cabin, but sturdier, better designed. They incorporated things Aida knew from her people. Better insulation, better ventilation, smarter use of space. It became a hybrid structure, blending white and crow techniques into something uniquely theirs. By September, the cabin was finished. They had a garden planted, a smokehouse built, enough supplies laid in for winter. They had even made tentative contact with the small settlement downriver, a trading post run by a French Canadian who did not care much about where people came from or what they looked like. He was willing to trade for furs and hides. That was enough. Life fell into new rhythms. Jacob worked the trap lines. Aida tended the garden and preserved food for winter. They improved the cabin in small ways, added a porch, built proper furniture, made it feel like home. In the evenings, they would sit outside and watch the river, planning future expansions. A barn, a bigger garden. Maybe chickens in the spring. It was a good life. Not easy. Never easy. But good, real, built on something solid. In October, Aida began to feel sick in the mornings. At first, Jacob worried it was something serious. Disease. Infection. But Aida knew better. She had seen the signs in other women, the way her body was changing, the particular kind of exhaustion, the sensitivity to certain smells. She was pregnant. When she told Jacob, using signs and broken English and finally just placing his hand on her still flat belly, he felt something massive shift in his chest. A child? Their child. Life continuing forward instead of just enduring. Hope made flesh. He pulled her close and held her, feeling her breathe against him, feeling the future taking shape between them. This was the apice of everything. Not dramatic, not loud, just this. Two people who had survived impossible things, building something new, something that would outlast them both. I love you, he said, the first time he had spoken those words to her in English. She had learned enough of the language now to understand. She pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were shining. She signed back, using the crow gesture he had learned months ago. Then she said it aloud, her accent thick, but the meaning unmistakable. I love you. That winter was gentler than the previous one. The valley did not get as cold as Montana. The snow was manageable. They were prepared. Well supplied, secure. Jacob built a cradle from pine wood, carving designs into the headboard. Traditional patterns Aida showed him. Something for their child to carry forward. A blend of both worlds. In March, as the first flowers began to push through the snow, Aida went into labor. It was long and hard. Jacob had never felt so helpless, but she was strong. So strong. She worked with her body, using techniques her grandmother had taught her, and just before dawn, their daughter was born. She was perfect. Tiny and red and squalling with fury at being pulled from warmth into cold. Jacob held her with shaking hands, marveling at how fragile she seemed. How impossibly small. Aida watched him with exhausted eyes, smiling at his terror. "She is strong," Aida said, "like her father. Like her mother. She will survive anything." Jacob believed her. They named the baby Sarah Aida, honoring both paths while building toward the future. It felt right. Complete. A circle closing and opening at the same time. As spring turned to summer, Jacob would sit on the porch with his daughter in his arms, watching Aida work in the garden, and feel something he never expected to feel again. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Something deeper, more stable. The knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with. The journey from that frozen Montana cabin to this valley had been impossible. Everything had been stacked against them. Different ages, different cultures, different worlds. The timing had been terrible, the circumstances dire. Every rational reason said they should have failed, but they had not failed. Against all odds, against all logic, they had built something that lasted. Something real. A family. A home. A future. Sometimes, late at night, Jacob would lie awake and think about the random chance that had brought them together. If Aida had run in a different direction, if she had found a different cabin, if he had turned her away, if either of them had chosen fear over faith, their daughter would not exist. This life would not exist, but she had run toward him, and he had opened the door, and that simple act had changed everything. Jacob had lost Sarah to the cruel winter. That would always be true. That grief would always be part of him, but Aida had brought life back, not as a replacement, as something new, something that honored what came before while building toward what came next. He thought about that first morning, finding her collapsed on his floor. He had assumed she was there by accident. Random chance. Bad luck. But now he wondered if maybe there were no accidents. Maybe the universe had conspired to bring two broken people together at exactly the right moment, when they both needed saving, when they both needed proof that life could continue even after everything fell apart. Maybe that was what love was. Not the grand passionate thing from storybooks. But this, two damaged people choosing each other, day after day, through difficulty and doubt, through fear and uncertainty, building something sturdy enough to stand against the wind. Jacob looked down at his daughter sleeping in his arms. She had Aida's dark hair and his light eyes, a perfect blend, a bridge between worlds. She would grow up knowing both languages, both cultures, both sides of herself. She would be stronger for it. The sun was setting over the valley, painting everything gold. Aida came to sit beside him on the porch, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade, listening to the river flow. Three people where there had been one. Three heartbeats where there had been desperate loneliness. Happy? Aida asked quietly. Jacob thought about it. Really thought. Was he happy? He had lost so much, endured so much. The scars would never fully heal. But yes, despite everything, because of everything. Yes, he said. I am happy. She squeezed his hand. They sat like that as darkness fell and stars emerged, one by one, filling the sky with ancient light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be hard times ahead. Life was never simple. But they would face it together. That was enough. That was everything. In the distance, a wolf howled. Then another answered. The sound carried across the valley, wild and free and alive. Jacob smiled. Once, that sound would have meant loneliness, isolation, the emptiness of existence. Now it meant something else. Connection, community. The understanding that even in the darkest winter, even when everything seems lost, there is always the possibility of spring, of renewal, of finding someone who sees you at your worst and chooses to stay anyway. The cabin behind them was warm and solid. The garden was thriving. The trap lines were productive. They had built something sustainable, something that would last. But more than that, they had built something worth lasting for. Each other, their daughter, the family they had created from grief and survival and impossible circumstances. Jacob had entered that Montana winter thinking he would die there, either literally or spiritually. Instead, he had found a reason to live, and not just live, but thrive, to build, to hope, to love again. Aida had lost everything, her people, her village, her past. But in losing, she had also found a partner, a home, a future. She had survived when survival seemed impossible, and now she was creating new life, new possibilities, new stories to tell their daughter someday. They were proof that endings were not always final, that sometimes the worst moment of your life is just the beginning of something you never could have imagined, something better. Something earned through pain and struggle and the simple act of choosing to keep going. The stars continued to emerge. The valley grew quiet, and in the cabin on the hill, a small family settled in for the night. Safe, together, home, against all odds. Despite everything, because of everything, they had made it.